Welcome to Entry Level Photovoltaics, brought to you by Renewable Training. This is Lesson 1, Part 4. This lesson's objective is to list the advantages and disadvantages of PV systems compared to alternative electricity generation sources. Really quick, alternative electricity generation sources are going to be your coal plants, your everyday, the original sources of power, so the more polluting ones and all that. And we're just going to go through now and we're going to talk about some of the benefits for both. So benefits for PV: it allows you to avoid rising costs, which we've talked about before. Reliable power, it's environmentally friendly, economically for the long term. And dive into that a little more here. It's economical in the long term in that right now the payback is roughly around 20 years. Depending on rebates and tax credits and all that, it can shorten some, but your core repayment on it is around 20 years, which means it's going to be roughly that long before you make your money back from the savings. So if you're not planning on being in a home for very long and you're not going to be in that location for more than 20 years, PV might not be a logical step for you. Now, if you're commercial, it's the same thing. If you plan on having your business in a location for the long term, then it's illogical and it's very economical for you. The other thing is there's no regular maintenance. Most PV systems, once they're up and running, they run. Usually they'll recommend it being inspected and gone over every so often. But usually in that 20-year period, you can go usually the 20 years without any major problems. The only real big problem I would see going wrong would be is if the inverter went out on you, which is going to be a big cost because those are a couple $1,000s. But if it's just a panel or something that goes out on you, that's not as big of a cost. It's only a couple $100 or whatever to replace the panel. It's really quick. It's really simple. So the other thing is it's storable. And by storable, it means you can have a battery backup system and stuff like that, so you can store it for use later. Batteries are going to require a little maintenance. You got to keep on top of that and make sure none of them go bad with cracks and stuff like that, but they last a long time. Now on the electricity side, the benefits over there is it's cheaper for startup. You're connected to the power grid, you've got power. You're not dropping 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $60,000 depending on the size of the system you're getting. Commercial systems for large offices and stuff like that, much more expensive. But if you're in an office with hundreds and hundreds of people running lights and computers and scanners and printers and all that, then your payback's going to be pretty quick. Also, your traditional sources like coal and stuff are not affected by the weather. If it's overcast and cloudy for months on end, you're not producing as much electricity as you would be with PV. So that's an effect you gotta take into consideration. Not gonna be able to use it in all areas, but usually PV can be of some benefit. Next up is some of the disadvantages. Like I mentioned earlier, the cost of startup for PV is high. It's a high startup cost, long payback, but in the long run it is worth it. Availability issues, not seeing these as much currently, but there are still problems getting a hold of panels in some places because for the US anyway, most panels are going overseas because the demand is way greater over there and they're just getting a hold of them all. Stateside is having issues with that. Not as big of an issue currently because most manufacturing is being kicked up, just drastic increases in the production of PV panels because of the huge demand. Now that might die off eventually, but I don't see that happening for a while because it's continually growing. Every year now PV just jumps more and more and more. Like we mentioned before, PV relies on the weather. So disadvantage is if it's cloudy and stormy in wintertime, you're not getting as much out of your PV system. Whereas electricity from a coal plant or whatever is still providing you plenty of power. It's not going to affect it. Now on electricity, disadvantages is it requires regular maintenance. It's got all kinds of parts and stuff that got to be maintained and checked and maintenance performed on regularly. Not as reliable, costly long term because you got to replace stuff breaks, all the regular maintenance, all the moving stuff starts to add up. You cannot store. Once it's produced, it gets used, it gets transferred out. That's that. There's not really any storage kind of stuff going on right now for that. Whereas with PV, you can do the battery storage and all that. So those are some of the advantages. These are the disadvantages. It's kind of a toss-up. I really don't think any of PV's disadvantages are really gonna be a stopper, except for the startup cost, because that is a pretty big cost. If you got to drop like $10,000, $15,000. Not quite sure what the rebates are. It depends on your area, and tax credits and all that are changing pretty regularly, but they're becoming better and better. So your action step for this lesson is research the advantages and disadvantages of PV systems compared to alternative electricity generation sources. Come up with either an advantage or disadvantage that we have not listed here. Maybe you have an example of something that you really liked about PV and you consider it an advantage. Tell us your story. Maybe you work for the electric company. Maybe you've worked at a coal company. You can let us know. Maybe maintenance isn't as much there or something. Let us give us personal experience on either the PV or the alternative electric sources. We don't really focus on the alternative electric sources because it's all about PV and stuff. So if you got a personal experience there, we'd love to hear about that too. So that concludes lesson 1 part 4.